challenging books, or hard books. I am a big proponent of doing things in teeny tiny little steps, just breaking them down into teeny tiny steps, and then you're not even worrying about what the rest of the steps are. There are no other steps. All you're doing is what you're doing right this moment. First, let's define what is a challenging book. There are probably some books that the majority of people would consider challenging, like War and Peace or something, but maybe you're a War and Peace scholar, and so that's not the challenging book for you. If you think Shakespeare is challenging, there are people out there who only read Shakespeare and love Shakespeare and have degrees in Shakespeare, and so that is not their challenging book. This is not a one-size-fits-all. This is just a how-to-read books that challenge you. Books that you would not normally pick up to read. Either because you're afraid they'll take too long to read, or they'll be boring, or you won't understand them, or they'll be dense enough or beyond your comfort level enough that you can't get sucked into them, so you end up feeling bored. You know, whatever the case may be, challenging books. My tips in this video are created with two things in mind. The first is to successfully read challenging books, but to have it be fun, like an enjoyable experience. Not the type of goal where you're like beating yourself up to make yourself do something, like look how much I can handle type of goal. That is not this type of goal. The aim of this is to help you enjoy even the possibility of reading books outside your comfort zone. The second thing I was thinking about when thinking about these tips is reading as a writer. I'm a writer, this is a writing channel, and although there are many ways to grow as a person and as a writer, I think one of the least used ways, like one of the most overlooked ways to grow as a writer, is to read books that make you uncomfortable. Either because they are outside your realm of typical reading, or you have never had any interest in writing that type of book, so you don't read it thinking it won't help your writing. I think that really can box you in, because the reality is, when you read books that are way outside anything you normally read, or way outside anything you have any interest in writing, I think you really have the potential to learn the most, because every page will be unfamiliar to you. The style, the voice, the word choice, the pacing, everything will be new, and it will just really, tickle a part of your brain that you really just don't use, because those aren't the types of books that you interact with on a day-to-day basis. I think it'd be very helpful. So, how to read challenging books, with the goal of enjoying them and also thinking like a writer. Tip number 1, choose 5 books that you think of as challenging, but also that, in the far reaches of the world where if someone was like, you must read challenging books, these would be the 5 that you would probably choose. You're just I'm maybe intrigued, but also I would never actually read that probably. Pick those, the 5 books. And it could be anything. So if you write literary fiction, or maybe you're very comfortable with experimental literary fiction, or very focused literary fiction that might put off other people, that might be your jam, and so you don't pick those books because you're already familiar with that type of writing. Maybe a challenging book for a person like that would be epic fantasy or classic horror or something. Just books that you are unfamiliar with the genre, the type and style and quality of book. Choose 5. They don't have to all be the same type of genre, so if you write fantasy, you don't have to pick 5 grounded domestic literary fiction novels. You could pick 3 and then, I don't know, War and Peace? Shakespeare? I don't know. Any books that you find challenging, but also just the teensiest bit intriguing. Choose 5. And now, what you're gonna do is focus on tip number 1. There is no tip number 2 right now. We're only focusing on what we're doing in the moment. This is how I focus on everything. If you're wow, I need to start eating better, and then you get overwhelmed and you're oh my goodness, look at all these vegetables I have to eat. That's just overwhelming. I don't do it that way. I think to myself, alright, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to eat 1 serving of produce every day. I literally do this. If you watch me make my habit tracker, you will see I wrote down on the habit tracker, produce. 1 serving of produce per day. And then you build slowly. Once it starts feeling oh yeah, 1 serving of produce per day, that's child's play. Then you move on to the next step of, 2 servings of produce per day. You build small. That's the key here. So, you're going to read the first page of all 5 of those books. Not thinking in the future. You're not thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to read all 5 of these books. No, you're not. Right now we are only on tip 1, and when you're on a tip, there's no other tips to be thinking about. This is the only step that matters. So, maybe it takes you a day or a weekend, or however long it takes you to read 5 pages. It might be different based on the density of the text or any number of things, but you're going to read the first page of the 5 books that you have chosen. And that's all. Probably and hopefully when you're reading them, you will notice one or more of them feel a little bit more compelling to you than others. For example, you might easily recognize, even on the first page, that this writing is just really not speaking to you. And that's fine. You're only reading the first page of the 5 books. And more than likely, I also hope that it will feel like an accomplishment, because to me, when I even open a book that I have told myself I'm never going to read, because it's just way outside the realm of what I read, and then I read a little bit of it, it feels like a success. You know, it feels like, oh, hey, I can do this. I can do hard things. So however long it takes you to read 5 pages, do it. And try to keep notice of the ones that, you know, kind of don't really speak to you versus the ones where you're like, I could maybe read another page or two. So that's tip number 1. Now, step number 2 is you're going to choose at least 3 of the books. You could choose all 5 if they all kind of felt a little bit something in you when you were reading them. More than likely, 1 or 2 of them would feel like, you know, I'm not into it. You know, if it was a struggle to get through the first page, you can nix that off the list. So you're going to choose at least 3. If they were all a struggle to get through the first page, I would highly recommend you continue on with the steps to be reading the challenging books, but it's also possibly like you picked 5 of the wrong books. Like maybe you didn't pick ones that you had ever really thought like, I could read that, you know, like some classic Shakespeare or something, or I don't know, Jane Austen. You had no intention of ever reading them. You had never even heard of them. You just picked books willy-nilly. Maybe you could start feeling like, I don't care about any of these books, but hopefully you picked some books that had a little bit of interest to you. Maybe just a small familiarity, and you were able to pick books where at least 3 of them felt like you could continue to read the next few pages. Step 3 is you're going to read the first chapter of all 3 of those books. Again, you know, however long it takes you, this isn't something you have to all do in 1 day or 1 week or something. You read the first chapter of 1 book, however long that takes you, then you read the first chapter of the second book, however long that takes you, and the first chapter of the third book, however long that takes you. While you're reading the first chapter of these 3 novels, more than likely you will hit some snags and you will be like, oh yeah, I remember why I don't read books like this. But it's okay, because right now you're not reading the book like that. You're just reading the first chapter. You know, it's like a short story. It's like shorter than a short story. You just have to get to the end of chapter 1. And then you're done. You're pretty much done. You are all done with this step, and that is the only step that matters. Once you've finished reading the 3 books, however long it takes you, there's no rush. You don't have to do it all in 1 day. What you're going to do is set the books in front of you. This is what I do. It's helpful. And think to yourself, which ones of these did I struggle the most? And that doesn't mean that you're never going to read that book. It just means maybe it's not right for you right now. It's just not speaking to you right now, which is fine. Hopefully, out of the 3, you can pick one where you, even if you were struggling, you were at least intrigued to continue reading. Either because something in the language was like really new and innovating, or anything really. The story, I don't know. Hopefully there's one that you're like, you know, I kind of want to figure out what happens. That's great! You picked that one. That's the book you're going to read next. And again, hopefully there is one where even if you're like, this book is so dense, I'm never going to read all the way to the end. There's at least one where you're like, you know, but I could keep reading a few more pages. Pick that book. If none of the books are like that, and if when you were reading them, all of the books were like an absolute slog, and you were like, I hate myself, why am I doing this? Why is this book even in existence? I would still encourage you to pick one. I mean, okay, so I tell myself that I'm not a proponent, like I don't force myself to read to the end of all of the books that I read because I know that that's healthy. But also, I hate giving up on things, so I often make myself read, you know, further into books that I really need to, because you can learn a lot. Like, if you sit yourself down to be reading something challenging and you're like, well, I'm not into this, and you toss it right away, you know, you miss out on stuff. But if you've been reading, you know, for like half the book and you're like, I can't do it anymore. You'll learn something from that too, because if you put the book down even when you're halfway through, then you can sit back and think, what is happening in this book that makes me, you know, hate it so much? Is it confusing? Is it boring? Is it repetitive? You know, that's still useful for your growth as a human and as a writer. But the difference is, when I'm reading for pleasure, I in no way make myself read to the end. I'm just reading, and then I get to a point where I'm like, I don't care what happens anymore. And then I just stop reading, and I never feel guilt about it. But when I'm reading to challenge myself, the guilt doesn't really come into play, but it's more like, you know, I could go further. You know, that kind of feeling. And so what I would recommend is you take the book of the 3 after you've read the first chapters that you're going to read, and you tell yourself you're going to read it. This is the book you're going to read next. And then you read. You know, and you read every day. That's important, even if you only read one page every day, or if you're like, I'm going to read a chapter a week, break it down small like that, but read every day. If you're like, this is the next book I'm going to read, and I'm going to read it all in one day, 3 months from now, that's useless because you're never going to do that. So, read every day, even if you're just like, I'm going to read 1 page a day. That's flawless. That's perfect. Do it. But I also like to keep in mind, you know, I'm currently reading to challenge myself. This isn't school. I'm not going to be punished if I don't read this. I'm not going to have to write a report if I don't read this. But I'm also, you know, not fully challenging myself if I don't challenge myself. So I try to read further in books that I'm reading to challenge myself than I would if I was reading for pleasure. So my recommendation would be, first, maybe try to read to the end, but that's not even realistic for me when I'm reading to challenge myself. Realistically, I would say read to the middle. If you read to the midpoint and you're like, I understand why I don't read these types of books, I hate them, that's fine, and you can stop reading that book and then sit back and think, you know, why am I struggling so much with this? What is it about this book that is so bad? Because like a lot of times challenging books are very highly acclaimed, or they're like literary classics, or they've been around for like literally hundreds of years, and then something about them speaks to people. What is it about it that puts you off so much? That's very important to notice. And you don't have to read all the way to the end of a book in order to notice that. But if you can't get through a book all the way to the end, I would recommend starting over at step 1 and picking wildly different books. So if in step 1 you picked a bunch of like literary classics, maybe the next time you do this challenge, if you couldn't get through the literary classic that you chose, you go back and you're like, I'm gonna read, you know, the story of Gilgamesh and the Odyssey and like ancient books. That's what I'm gonna choose next, just to challenge myself and just to see, you know, maybe that's what's going to be speaking to me more. Not necessarily in like a, this is what I'm going to read for pleasure from now on, or this is anything I'm ever going to write, but just like, what's more appealing to challenge myself with? These literary classics of the modern era that I'm just like, meh. Or like maybe these ancient writings are more appealing to me. And you know, that's fine. That's all fine and good. This is just how I read challenging text, you know, because like when you're in school, they make you read stuff. Hopefully you actually read. And you are introduced to all of these sentence structures even, and vocabulary, and not just the story itself or the type of place that it's setting, but every little bit of the writing is completely new to you because it's not anything you would ever seek out on your own. And that is just so important to continue searching for even when you're not in school, because it helps your brain grow and it also helps you grow as a writer. So this is what I do, you know? From time to time, I'm just like, what books am I ignoring the existence of? And then I'll, you know, test it out. I'll read the first page, and then, you know, maybe I'll read the first chapter. And then you learn, and it's fun, I tell you, and you feel like you've grown as a person. You've like put a little notch somewhere in your soul, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm still learning. I'm growing. It's good for you. I promise it's good for you. Also, a very important tip that I forgot to mention is it's so important when you're reading to challenge yourself to recognize that this is not reading for pleasure, and so it's gonna take longer than normal. I think an easy way for people to get burnt out or like start refusing to read books that challenge them is they think it should take them the same length of time that it takes them to read books that they read for fun. And that is just not true. That's just gonna harm you if that's what you're thinking. So like if normally it takes you like a week to read a book or something, it might take you a month. I mean, maybe even 6 weeks or something, maybe even longer, because you're reading a book that's challenging you. If it wasn't challenging you, it wouldn't even be part of the challenge. So just try to remember, you know, don't get discouraged if reading this book takes you significantly longer than reading for fun. That's part of the challenge, and it's important to recognize that that's part of the challenge, because it's not something where you have to think like, oh, I'm such a slow reader, this is why I don't read hard books, because it takes me too long. You're challenging yourself. Of course it's going to take longer. It's hard. It's a hard thing to do. Give yourself some time, some grace. It's, you know, enjoy the challenge. The length of time is part of the challenge, and it's important to recognize that it's going to happen, but also to enjoy the time. You're spending time challenging yourself. You're not just breezing by on something easy. Keep that